So the question arises, was there a need for change? You know, it's a funny thing about change. I bet all of you, as you look at where you live, or your jobs, or our community, you can probably imagine things that could improve, things that could be done better. All of us have the ability to do that. We can always imagine how something could be improved. And it's a funny thing about human beings. When somebody says the word change, you begin to roll that picture in your head. What could improve? What could be better? What can we do that's better? We begin to assume that we understand the definition of the word change. So the question is, was there a need for change in that country? Well, a charismatic leader began to point out the need for change. And at some point in time in this description, I want you to think about whether any of this sounds familiar to you. This guy was young. This guy was in his 40s. He was extremely well educated. He had a doctorate in law. He graduated from the best university in that country as an attorney. Now let me tell you, he was extremely charismatic. This was the kind of guy who would listen on television and think, you know, I like him. He had likability. And he was one fantastic speaker. He was an orator. And by the way, there were no teleprompters at that time. And this fellow began to argue against the extremes in that society. He began to expound on the need for social change. These were the words he used. And he began to expound on the need for social justice. Once again, if any of these words sound familiar to you, he promised free education, free health care, and a more just society. And he promised, and I promise you he used these words exactly, he promised a fundamental change. Now, whatever made this guy credible? Well, he had 2 books published. And news articles about this young and charismatic leader began to be spread around the world. The media liked him. In fact, the New York Times and the Washington Post and many other newspapers had front-page coverage of this new leader and this vision for change. He was worldwide famous at the time. And finally, with all of those talents, he gained power on January the 1st, 1959. And I'm here to tell you that change began to take place indeed. I want to review the change that I saw. In four short years, 4. First, he had nationalized all major industrial groups, all large companies had been taken over by the government and nationalized. He had nationalized the petroleum industry and all mining companies. He had nationalized major broadcasting companies, newspaper publishers, and certainly all insurance companies. We're talking about 4 years now. He had nationalized all major banks. And now, all of the employees of all of these companies that were taken over became government employees. He did make the owning of firearms by private citizens illegal. And yes, he established universal health care. Might I add, all private hospitals in this country failed shortly thereafter because the payments that were supposed to be made by the government after the law were not enough to keep the hospitals open. It gets worse. He standardized school curriculums and all student measurements. Let me stop right there and tell you. When somebody says to you, I'm going to standardize school curriculums and I'm going to standardize student measurements so that all of our children all over the nation can be assured of receiving the same quality of education. That doesn't sound reasonable. That sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? There are always unintended consequences. After that, private schools, church-sponsored schools, theological institutions, and homeschooling accreditation facilities were shut down. Gee, they didn't quite meet the new government standards. Think about that. In fact, 4 years later, in 1962, this man declared the country to be officially an atheist country. And the mention of God had disappeared. And yes, there was visible change because a new flag began to fly from flagpoles along with the national flag that I showed you earlier. That's how far we went in 4 years. No question that fundamental change had been accomplished as promised. And it continues 51 years later without change. It wasn't quite the change we thought it meant. Now, how can I stand up here and say all of this to you? What gives me the credibility to share all of this with you? Well, I'll tell you. I was born and I was raised and I was educated in Cuba. And I saw it. I witnessed it. I saw the first years of this fundamental transformation. I heard these speeches. And ladies and gentlemen, deja vu all over again. I've heard these speeches before. I've seen these laws passed before. I've seen the taking over of major industry before. Sounds terribly familiar. I was forced to leave my country at age 16, and I'll tell you this, the first 2 or 3 years here were not a piece of cake. But, God bless me, I came to the best country in the world. And here I was able to attend university, go Dogs. And I was able to work, and I became a U.S. citizen 8 years after I arrived. Now, by this time, you've got to be saying to yourself, now surely, no, that couldn't happen here. This is the United States of America. It couldn't happen here. It couldn't. Or couldn't. Well, let's talk about it. You've already seen the nationalization of the largest and the third largest automobile companies in the world, both of them private companies, General Motors and Chrysler. There is a czar running these companies for the government. You've seen it happen. It's happened. The nationalization of the largest insurance company in the world, also a private company, has already happened. And by the way, there's a czar in charge of that.